The crisp air of an autumn morning crept through the Thompson household, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Eleanor Thompson stirred in her bed, her dreams dissolving into the haze of dawn. A gnawing unease gripped her before she was even fully awake, a mother's intuition that something was amiss. Beside her, Richard snored softly, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The house was quiet, too quiet. She turned to the bedside clock. 6:13 a.m. It was unlike Lucas to sleep in. He was always up early, clattering around the kitchen for his cereal before school. Sliding out of bed, Eleanor pulled on her robe and padded down the hallway to Lucas's room. The door was slightly ajar, and the sight inside stopped her cold. Lucas's bed was untouched. The covers lay smooth, undisturbed. His favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Paws, sat neatly against the pillow, as if Lucas had placed it there himself. A wave of dread washed over her, icy and paralyzing. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of her son. The window was closed, the curtains drawn halfway. His school bag lay untouched by the door, its zipper half open. "Richard," she called out, her voice trembling. "Richard, wake up. Lucas isn't here." Footsteps thundered down the hall as Richard appeared, his face groggy but quickly sharpening with concern. "What do you mean, he's not here?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Look at his bed," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "He didn't sleep here last night. His bag is still packed." "Something's wrong, Richard." Panic set in as they searched the house. Richard checked the backyard, calling Lucas's name into the crisp morning air. Eleanor tore through the basement and closets, her breath quickening with each empty room. The front door was locked from the inside, the windows latched shut. There were no signs of forced entry, no misplaced furniture, no shattered glass. It was as if Lucas had simply evaporated. By the time the clock struck 8 a.m., the Thompsons were on the phone with the police. Eleanor's voice cracked as she relayed the details to the dispatcher, her hands trembling. Within the hour, their quiet suburban street was swarming with flashing lights and uniformed officers. Neighbors peered out from their windows, murmuring among themselves as they watched the commotion. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers combing through the nearby woods with grim determination. The air buzzed with tension and the growing realization that something terrible had happened. Detective Harry Graves arrived around noon, his demeanor calm and composed amidst the chaos. A veteran investigator with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases, Harry surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. He approached the Thompsons with a measured stride, his notebook in hand. "No signs of forced entry," he said after a cursory inspection of the house. "And no witnesses saw anything unusual overnight?" Eleanor shook her head, clutching Mr. Paws to her chest like a lifeline. "He's only 10, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucas wouldn't run away. He's scared of the dark. He'd never leave like this." Harry nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll do everything we can to find him, Mrs. Thompson. But I need you to think carefully. Was there anything unusual about Lucas's behavior yesterday? Did he seem upset or mention anything strange?" Eleanor's mind raced, but she could find no answers. "He was fine," she said, her voice breaking. "He did his homework at the kitchen table, had dinner, and went to bed like he always does. Nothing was out of the ordinary." Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, though his own face was lined with worry. "Please find our son, detective," he said. Harry's gaze lingered on Richard for a moment before he turned back to his notes. "We'll start with the woods," he said. "It's the most likely place for someone to leave a trail." As the search party ventured deeper into the forest, the weight of uncertainty settled over the Thompsons. Hours stretched into eternity, each minute thick with fear and desperation. Flyers bearing Lucas's photograph were distributed across the neighborhood, plastered onto telephone poles and bulletin boards. The local news picked up the story. 10-year-old boy mysteriously disappears without a trace. Eleanor watched the search efforts from the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The autumn breeze carried the faint scent of damp earth and decay. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching from the shadows. Detective Harry Graves worked through the night, piecing together every fragment of information he could find. The Thompsons' house had yielded no obvious clues, and the initial sweep of the woods had come up empty. But Harry knew better than to rely on the obvious. Disappearances like this were rarely random, and the answer was often buried in the details. He started with Lucas's last known movements. Eleanor and Richard's accounts were consistent. Lucas had spent the evening doing his homework, eating dinner, and going to bed. There was no indication that he had planned to leave the house or meet anyone. But Harry's instincts told him there was more to the story. "Is there something you're not telling me, Mr. Thompson?" Harry asked during their second interview. They sat in the living room, the air between them tense. Richard's eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to Harry. "No," he said firmly. I just can't believe this is happening. We're good parents. Lucas is a good kid. Why would anyone take him?" Harry made a note in his book. Richard's reaction wasn't unusual, but there was something about his tone, a subtle undercurrent of guilt or fear. It was too early to draw conclusions, but Harry filed it away for later. The breakthrough came late in the afternoon, when one of the search teams found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a thorn bush at the edge of the woods. It was bright red, unmistakably from Lucas's hoodie. Harry examined the fabric under a magnifying glass, noting the jagged edges. "This means he was out here," he told his team. "But why? And how did he get this far without anyone noticing?" When Eleanor saw the fabric, her reaction was visceral. She clutched it to her chest, her sobs racking her body. "He hates the woods," she cried. "Lucas would never go in there alone. Someone must have forced him." Harry knelt beside her, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to think carefully, Eleanor. Is there anyone who might want to hurt your family? Anyone who's had a grudge against you or Richard?" Eleanor shook her head vehemently, but her hesitation betrayed her. Harry's eyes narrowed. He could sense the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. This wasn't just about Lucas. There was more to the story, and he was determined to uncover it. The first 7 days after Lucas disappeared passed in a haze of sleepless nights and relentless worry. Eleanor Thompson found herself on the edge of exhaustion, her mind caught in an endless loop of questions with no answers. She moved through the house like a ghost, her every thought tethered to her missing son. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent her heart racing. But Lucas was still gone. Late one night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, Eleanor sat in Lucas's room. The small space still smelled faintly of him, a mix of bubblegum shampoo and the faint musk of childhood adventures. She perched on the edge of his bed, clutching Mr. Paws, Lucas's favorite stuffed bear. Her fingers ran over the worn fur, smoothing it again and again, as if by sheer will, she could summon him home. It was then that she noticed something odd. The window latch. It was unlocked. Eleanor frowned, her pulse quickening. She distinctly remembered locking it the night Lucas went missing. She'd made a habit of ensuring every window was secure before bed, especially after hearing about burglaries in the area months ago. Her mind raced. Had someone entered through the window? Or worse, had Lucas let someone in? She leaned closer, inspecting the latch. The smudges on the sill looked faintly like fingerprints. Her breath hitched as a wave of nausea rose in her throat. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Detective Harry Graves. "Detective," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you need to come over. I think someone might have come through Lucas's window." Detective Graves arrived within 20 minutes, his expression serious. He carried a flashlight and a small evidence kit, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone used to unsettling truths. Eleanor led him to Lucas's room, pointing out the unlocked latch and the faint smudges. "It's possible someone came through here," Harry said after a long pause. "But it doesn't make sense. There's no sign of a struggle, no noise reported by neighbors. If someone entered this way, they either knew exactly what they were doing, or—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Eleanor's voice cracked. "Or what? Or Lucas left willingly." The thought hit her like a physical blow. "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "Lucas would never do that. He's scared of the dark, detective. He wouldn't just walk out on his own." Harry's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "Mrs. Thompson, I've seen cases where children act out of character. Fear or trust can make them do things they'd never normally consider." Eleanor's mind whirled. Who could Lucas possibly trust enough to leave the safety of their home? A neighbor? A teacher? A family friend? The thought sent a chill down her spine. The next day, Eleanor's doubts began to grow, not just about strangers but about the people closest to her. As she sat in the kitchen, staring at the cold remnants of her untouched coffee, fragments of conversations and small inconsistencies started to gnaw at her. Richard had been acting off. He'd been supportive, yes, but there was a certain distance in his demeanor. He avoided eye contact during discussions with Detective Graves, and his answers, while plausible, felt rehearsed. She recalled a moment from the previous week. Richard had come home late from work, his tie loosened, his face flushed. When she'd asked about his day, he'd brushed her off with a vague answer about a client dinner. At the time, she'd dismissed it. But now, with Lucas missing, every minor detail seemed magnified. Could Richard be hiding something? Eleanor shook her head, ashamed of the thought. He was Lucas's father. He loved their son as much as she did. And yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing hour. That evening, as Richard sat in the living room scrolling through his phone, Eleanor approached him. "Richard," she began, her voice tentative, "can we talk?" He glanced up, his expression wary. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I feel like we're not on the same page. About Lucas. About everything." Richard's brow furrowed. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying that I need to know if there's anything you're not telling me," she said, her voice breaking. "Anything at all. Even if you think it's small." He set his phone down, his jaw tightening. "You think I'm hiding something?" "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know what to think anymore. Our son is missing, Richard. And I feel like I'm going insane trying to piece this together." For a moment, Richard looked as though he might respond, but then he stood abruptly. "I can't do this right now," he muttered, walking toward the door. "Where are you going?" Eleanor demanded. "For a walk," he said without looking back. "I need some air." The door slammed shut, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and an ever-deepening sense of dread. Later that night, Eleanor received a call from Mrs. Gibbons, the elderly neighbor who lived across the street. "I didn't want to bother you earlier, dear," Mrs. Gibbons said, her voice quavering, "but I remembered something from the night Lucas disappeared. I thought you should know." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly. "What is it?" "I saw a car parked outside your house around midnight," Mrs. Gibbons said. "It was an older sedan. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Eleanor's heart raced. "Did you see who was inside?" "No," Mrs. Gibbons admitted. "But I thought you should know." It seemed out of place. After hanging up, Eleanor relayed the information to Detective Graves. His response was immediate. "We'll look into it," he promised. "But I need you to stay vigilant, Eleanor. Sometimes the people closest to us aren't what they seem." His words lingered long after the call ended. Eleanor sat in the darkened living room, staring out the window at the street below. The world outside seemed foreign and cold, filled with shadows that threatened to swallow her whole. In the quiet moments before dawn, as the first rays of light crept over the horizon, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth about Lucas's disappearance, no matter where it led. Even if it meant facing the possibility that the answers she sought might shatter her family beyond repair. The air in the Thompson household was thick with dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, seemed to amplify the silence left by Lucas's disappearance. Eleanor sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes unfocused, staring at the same spot on the wall as though searching for answers hidden in the cracks of the paint. Her hands trembled as she gripped a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The warmth of the mug had once comforted her. Now, it was just another reminder of how much had changed in such a short span of time. The days since Lucas had vanished had been a blur of police interviews, endless questions, and futile searches. But today, something was different. A shift. A potential lead. The doorbell rang. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been expecting anyone, but with everything that had been happening, the sound of the bell was enough to make her stomach twist in nervous anticipation. She slowly got to her feet, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, and walked to the door. On the other side stood Mrs. Gibbons, a frail woman with wispy gray hair and eyes that had seen more of the world than most people could ever imagine. Mrs. Gibbons had lived in the house across the street for as long as Eleanor could remember. She was a woman of few words, often keeping to herself, but her presence in the neighborhood was a constant, like an old tree that had weathered every storm. "I need to speak with you," Mrs. Gibbons said, her voice trembling slightly. There was an urgency to her tone that sent a chill through Eleanor's spine. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. Was this news of Lucas? Was she about to hear something that could lead them to him? "I saw something," Mrs. Gibbons replied, stepping inside when Eleanor opened the door. "Something I should have told you sooner." Eleanor's mind raced. Had the woman seen something about Lucas's disappearance? She ushered Mrs. Gibbons to the living room, and the two women sat across from each other, their eyes locking with a shared understanding of the gravity of the situation. "I don't know if this means anything," Mrs. Gibbons began, her voice wavering, "but the night your son disappeared, I saw a car parked outside your house. It was around midnight." Eleanor's breath hitched. Midnight. That was the exact time when Lucas had been last seen, when he had wandered out of the house for reasons they still couldn't understand. Had he been taken? Had someone been watching them? "A car," Eleanor repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "What kind of car? Did you see who was inside?" Mrs. Gibbons looked down, wringing her hands together. "It was an older sedan. I couldn't tell the make, but it was dark-colored, probably black or deep blue. The kind of car you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. It was parked for a while, too. At least an hour, maybe more." Eleanor's mind spun. An older sedan? That wasn't much to go on. Still, it was something. Something to hang on to in a sea of uncertainty. "And did you see anyone inside?" Eleanor pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Gibbons's eyes narrowed as she tried to recall the details. "I think I saw someone. Maybe a man. Or a woman. I'm not sure. The windows were tinted. All I know is that they were sitting there, waiting. Waiting." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, settling over the room with an oppressive heaviness. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. Could this have been the person who took Lucas? And why had they parked outside their house? Had they been watching him? Had they been planning it all along? "Why didn't you tell anyone sooner?" Eleanor asked, the accusation creeping into her voice. "You should have told the police." Mrs. Gibbons flinched, her frail shoulders hunching slightly as though she had been struck. "I didn't think it was important. I didn't think it would matter. But it did matter. It mattered more than anything else." Eleanor stood up, her heart hammering in her chest. "I need to tell Harry. We need to." But before she could finish her sentence, the front door creaked open. Eleanor froze. Harry. Her heart sank as she turned toward him, her stomach twisting. He stood there, his face etched with the weight of too many sleepless nights. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. They were both drowning in the same sea of grief, but this was different now. This wasn't just grief. This was something darker. Something more sinister. Harry stepped inside, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Mrs. Gibbons. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low, tense. "Mrs. Gibbons saw something," Eleanor said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "A car. The night Lucas disappeared. She thinks someone was inside it." Harry's expression hardened as he turned to Mrs. Gibbons. "Do you recognize the car?" Mrs. Gibbons shook her head, her face pale. "No. I couldn't see much. Just the shape of it. But it was there outside your house. And the person inside, whoever it was waiting." Waiting. The word echoed in Harry's mind, stirring something cold and ugly deep inside him. He turned to Richard, who had been standing silently in the doorway. Harry had been so caught up in the conversation with Mrs. Gibbons that he hadn't even noticed the man enter the room. But now, with the tension thick between them, Richard's presence felt more oppressive than ever. "Mr. Thompson," Harry said, his voice sharp, "do you recognize the description of the car?" Richard hesitated. The silence between them stretched long and tight, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Harry could see Richard's jaw tighten, his muscles working as though he were trying to force the words out. But Richard only shook his head. "No, I don't," he said, his voice low. But Harry noticed something. The faint flicker in Richard's eyes. The subtle shift in his posture. Richard's face remained stoic, but his body language betrayed him. He knew more. He knew something. Harry could feel it, like a pinprick of ice creeping down his spine. Eleanor noticed it too. She glanced at her husband, a flash of suspicion crossing her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Richard spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I need to be alone." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He turned and walked toward the door, not waiting for a response. As he left, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Eleanor stared after him, her mind racing. What was he hiding? Why was he so desperate to avoid the truth? A knot of unease twisted in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that Richard knew more than he was letting on. And in the darkness of their home, where secrets festered like wounds left untreated, the truth was lurking just out of reach, waiting for the light. But would they ever find it? The weight of the case had been gnawing at Harry Graves for days. The uncertainty of Lucas's disappearance, the unnerving silence in the Thompson household, and the increasing sense that something, or someone, was hiding the truth, pressed down on him like a vice. But now, with Mrs. Gibbons's cryptic description of the car, a flicker of hope had finally emerged. It wasn't much, but it was something. Harry worked tirelessly, chasing every lead, no matter how small. His team scoured the town, searching for any trace that might lead them to Lucas. Every time he thought they were getting closer, the trail would go cold again. Yet, when the search for the car had stretched out across multiple counties, a breakthrough finally came. The car, described as an older sedan, was found parked near an abandoned farmhouse 2 towns over. It was a lead he couldn't afford to ignore. Harry arrived at the property just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the overgrown yard. The house looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself, its windows dark and empty, the lawn choked with weeds. It was a place that echoed with silence, as if the very land had given up hope. As Harry approached the front door, the faintest feeling of dread crept over him. What would he find inside? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something terrible had been waiting for him here. He stepped inside, his boots crunching against the debris scattered across the wooden floor. Dust blanketed the furniture, and the air was thick with a musty stench of mildew. The walls, once adorned with pictures and memories, were now bare and decaying. It was a house abandoned, left to rot as if it, too, had been forsaken by its owner. Then, in the silence, he heard it, a faint cry. It was barely audible, a sound so soft it could easily have been dismissed. But Harry knew the sound of a child's distress. His heart skipped a beat, and his body reacted on instinct. He sprinted up the creaky stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his mind racing. The cry grew louder as he approached the end of the narrow hallway. At the last door, he hesitated for only a fraction of a second before kicking it open. The room inside was dim, the light filtering through grime-covered windows. On the far side, sitting on a filthy mattress, was Lucas. His small form was hunched over, his face streaked with tear stains that had long dried. The boy was trembling, his eyes wide and filled with fear, as if the horrors of the past days had stolen his sense of security. Lucas looked up at Harry with a mixture of relief and terror. His lip quivered as he slowly reached out, like a child too afraid to trust the safety of an adult. "It's okay, Lucas," Harry said softly, kneeling down beside the boy. His voice was steady, calm, but inside, his heart raced. He didn't know how long Lucas had been in this place or what had happened to him, but at least the boy was alive. Lucas, in turn, threw himself into Harry's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The tension in the room seemed to crack, as though the fear that had held them both captive was finally giving way to something more hopeful. "I didn't want to go with her," Lucas whispered between sobs. His voice was small, broken. "She said Mommy and Daddy didn't love me anymore." Harry's blood ran cold at the words. They were incomprehensible in their cruelty, yet they made a twisted kind of sense. The child's fragile mind had been manipulated, filled with lies that no child should ever have to hear. "Who, Lucas?" Harry asked, his voice suddenly tense, the weight of his realization dawning on him. "Who took you? Who made you believe that?" Lucas, still trembling in Harry's arms, barely lifted his head to meet his gaze. His voice was a whisper, almost too faint to hear, but it struck Harry like a lightning bolt. "Aunt Claire," Lucas said. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Aunt Claire. The words made Harry's heart skip a beat. Claire. Eleanor's estranged sister. The woman who had cut ties with the family years ago, the one whose absence had never been questioned, whose disappearance had been a quiet rift in the Thompson family. Claire had vanished from their lives, a shadow in the background, leaving no trace, no explanation. They had assumed she was gone for good, her bitterness and anger buried with her. But now, the truth hit like a punch to the gut. Claire wasn't just gone, she was a part of this nightmare. Harry carefully stood, lifting Lucas in his arms. The boy clung to him like a lifeline, his sobs softening as he finally seemed to register that he was being taken out of the dark, dilapidated house. The weight of the moment pressed down on Harry, and as he carried the child back to the squad car, his mind whirred with the implications of what this meant. When Harry returned to the Thompson house, the emotions in the air were palpable. Eleanor stood at the door, her face a mask of both hope and dread. As soon as she saw Lucas, her knees buckled, and she collapsed into Harry's arms. She hadn't realized how much she needed to see him safe until that very moment. Her son, her only child, was home. Alive. But when Harry spoke, the joy was swiftly replaced with a cold chill. "Eleanor," he began, his voice heavy with the burden of truth. "Lucas is safe now. But there's more you need to know." Eleanor's face, which had softened with the relief of her son's return, hardened in an instant. She listened intently, her eyes never leaving Harry's as he explained everything. The car, the abandoned house, and most importantly, the reason behind Lucas's kidnapping. "Claire wanted revenge," Harry explained, his voice low. "She blamed you for cutting ties with her. In her twisted mind, taking Lucas was punishment. She thought that if she made you suffer, if she took your son from you, it would be the reckoning she needed." Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Claire," she whispered, the name barely audible as if saying it out loud would make the betrayal more real. "I never thought I never knew she could do something like this." The tears that had been held at bay since Lucas's return finally came, but they were not tears of relief. They were tears of confusion, of grief, and of the recognition that someone she once called family could harbor such hatred. "I never saw it," Eleanor continued, her voice cracking. "I never knew how deep her anger went." Harry didn't know what to say. He had seen it all before, the unexpected depths of human cruelty, the ways in which people could break apart when left unchecked by love or reason. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. As Harry left the Thompson house that evening, he paused for a moment on the sidewalk. He looked back at the window, where Eleanor and Richard sat, their son asleep between them, the family quietly piecing itself back together. But Harry couldn't shake the image of Claire, still out there, consumed by her twisted need for vengeance. The scars would remain, even if Lucas's body was safe. The truth had been revealed, but it had cost more than anyone had anticipated. Detective Harry Graves closed the file on the Vanishing Son. It was another case solved, but it left him with a lingering unease. Family, he realized, held the power to heal and to destroy. As he lit his pipe and stared out into the night, he whispered to himself, "People are capable of anything, even the ones we think we know." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, ready for the next case that would haunt his nights.